Games have a long history, with the earliest examples that we know about being some 5,000 to 6,000 years old. Games with especially long histories tend to pick up variations in their rules, either generally or specific to localities, house rules, if you will. We can see this in traditional games such as chess, and long-standing yet still relatively modern games such as Monopoly. Sometimes these variations can cause a level or three of strife. Just ask a regular Monopoly player what the correct use of the free parking space should be, for example. Some people get quite heated about it. When a game company decides to add clarity to a particular rule, say when the publishers of Monopoly decided to absolutely clarify the official use of the free parking space, advocates of a different perspective often feel let down. Even worse, when a game company decides to re-clarify a particular rule, so now it officially means something different. For example, when the word OK was added to the official list of accepted words for Scrabble in 2018, player outrage can be provoked. But when a game company changes the entire rule set, well, this, my friends, is the origin of what we know as edition wars, a fair few of which I have lived through, and, it appears, am still living through today. Edition wars usually appear within the role-playing game industry and community, and since that is one of the focuses of my channel, that's where we'll focus our video today. It is a truism in the world of role-playing games that in order to make a game continued financial success, it needs to be resold every so many years. There are two tricks to doing this. First, by revising and refreshing the rulebooks to have prettier art and cleaner layouts, as is the case for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons in 1983 and 1995. The second is by revising the game completely, as was the case for that same game in 1989, 2000, 2003, 2008 and 2014. In fact, as I write this, the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons has the longest history of any D&D edition between revisions of any kind. Why is this true? Well, simply put, no matter how popular you think the game is, it in no way compares to staples such as Monopoly. We role-players often live in a bubble, where we see RPG stuff everywhere, from YouTube playthroughs to a plethora of merchandising to all of the paraphernalia that we are prone to filling our houses with. But nearly every household in the Western world has at least one copy of Monopoly. That's something that D&D doesn't even approach. When you consider that D&D makes up an overwhelmingly huge proportion of role-playing sales, the presence of smaller games within the game market as a whole hardly registers. Fortunately, role-players tend to have a fan mindset, and tend to buy the latest variant of the core rulebooks for any given game that they have some investment in. How many of us bought the revised 1st and 2nd edition books when they came out, despite having serviceable copies of the original books, for example? But this relatively quick and often drastic changeover of editions also has its problems. With an industry that is only just coming up to its 5th decade, the number of editions role-playing games have gone through is quite staggering. 7 for D&D, potentially up to 10 or 11 depending on how you count the various versions of Basic, and how you count the 3.5 edition. At least 7 for Call of Cthulhu and RuneQuest. 5 plus parallel developments for Traveller, 4 to 6 for Rolemaster, and more for such RPG survivors as Vampire, Cyberpunk, Tunnels and Trolls and others. So what happens if you are a fan of a particular rule set and have invested a lot of your hard-earned time, effort and money into your game sessions with it, and the rug seemingly gets pulled from under you because the company that produces the game that you love so much decides it's time for a new edition? Well, there are lots of different ways to go. The primary one, and the one said game company is hoping that you will do, is to adopt the new rulebooks. You might stick with your favourite elder version, but continue to buy product from the new line and convert it over. Equally a win for the company because you'll need to purchase the new books to understand where conversions are needed. You might draw a line under making purchases and stick with your favourite edition. You might buy into a clone version of the rule system that you love, opening up a nest of support materials to keep you going where the company halts production of official releases. Or you might take to the proverbial or literal soapbox and proclaim the virtues of your older version over this newfangled beasts that showed up on the doorstep? Well, you might do that and follow one of the options above, or some other path. When enough people have bought into such proclamations, an us versus them mentality arises, and thus an edition war is born. Often, these come about because of a feeling of entitlement, due to physical investment in a game, both financial and time, or because of a genuine feeling that the older version represents a better game. In recent years, a sense of political ideology has also arisen. A particular edition is, rightly or wrongly, associated with players who hold a particular socio-political view that is different from the observers, so therefore that game edition should not be embraced for fear of being associated with a contrasted ideology. Anyway, that's where edition wars come from. Now, what are they? Well, simply put, an edition war is a mass denigration of a particular game or game version, leading to the attack and defence of that game or game version, ranging from relatively civilised discussion to outright vitriol and hatred. In the oldie days, this sort of thing was limited to hobby shops, playgrounds, gaming clubs and magazine letter columns. These days, obviously, the vitriol can spread further and faster with the assistance of social media platforms and the internet in general. This goes beyond one individual simply saying that they don't like a particular version. This is normal. Opinions are subjective, and expressing likes and dislikes is a basic part of being. It is when a group of individuals actively attack or denigrate another group, indirectly or directly, others that are playing a version of that game that they do not agree with for whatever reason. Dungeons & Dragons is, as the most widely played game within the tabletop RPG market, the obvious example to examine. As noted previously, there are far more editions within the history of the game than the current 5th edition tag would suggest, and each edition has its fans. I myself am a fan of most of them to one extent or another. With the advent of the Open Game License in 2000, many of these editions have been resurrected in various guises: swords and wizardry, basic fantasy, Osric, and many more. And the current owners of the Dungeons & Dragons IP, Wizards of the Coast, have made every edition of the game, from its 1974 original through to its current 5th edition, available via PDF and print on demand. But still, the edition wars within Dungeons & Dragons rage on, particularly where older gamers are raging against newer editions, where some perceived one true way of playing the game is being usurped by current authors, and where the views of the modern world, which have evolved and continue to do so, where attitudes towards minorities, women and other groups are concerned, differ from those that the observer grew up with and are identified with, and are subject to disclaimers to note exactly that evolution and change that are seen as direct attacks against certain individuals or other groups. This, to my mind, is crazy. Let's take the disclaimer example. Here, Wizards of the Coast have labelled many of the products from the older Dungeons & Dragons editions that they have made available as PDF and print on demand, with a disclaimer, basically outlining the changing views of the world. There is no argument. The views of the world have changed, have moved on, from the time in the 1970s and 1980s when many of these products first released, and even from the 1990s and later. There is a greater understanding these days as to how certain depictions are insensitive to certain groups, and the disclaimers note that no one is being labelled racist or sexist. Authors from that period of time were simply writing to the modes that they lived within. Things have evolved, and a reader brought up in the more modern mode may get the impression that such an author had racist or sexist views. The disclaimer counters this. However, those of an even more sensitive nature have taken upon themselves to attempt, as an effort of futility as it happens, to counter the disclaimers in court. This is a fragile perspective, from a quarter that, for whatever reason, feels attacked when, in fact, no attack exists. There is no censoring here. Those older products are available without edits, with a simple disclaimer that explains to individuals that, in all likelihood, weren't alive during the period in which the material was written, as to why those books portray subjects that they might find in a strange way to read today. But the railing goes on against this progression of thought. We have to remember that even back in the day, the target age for Dungeons & Dragons, and give or take the content and complexity of a particular game, most RPGs, is 10 or 12 and up. Those of us in our 50s and older need to remember what the older folk thought of our music, our gaming, our hobbies and so on when we were that age, and cast that mirror back. Things like the Satanic Panic, playing Judas Priest records backwards, the outrage at the Sex Pistols, and many more. Those that are getting upset at simple and useful disclaimers are acting in the same way as those elders did against those elements of our youth back then. A similar level of faux outrage exists between games, not just between editions of the same game, and it is a similarly futile aspect of pointless rage. I don't like the Warhammer series of games, and there are several reasons why. And I may indeed take the mickey out of them from time to time. But do I get angry and call people names for playing them in anything more than a tongue-in-cheek manner? No. The games give their players enjoyment, and that is something that should be celebrated. So, what purpose do edition wars serve? None whatsoever. By engaging in them, the only person that you're really moving towards some form of anger-induced hernia or aneurysm is yourself. And it just ends up siloing and segregating the hobby of role-playing games as a whole. RPGs are fun, creative, and a highly subjective form of entertainment. Enjoy what you enjoy. Stop thinking people enjoying what they enjoy is some kind of personal attack against you, and keep the dice rolling.